My name's Max Markson, and welcome to the launch of The Forgotten. I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land, and pay my respects to the elders both past and present, and also welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people who may be joining us from other nations here and around the world. Well, I also like to welcome His Excellency General the Honourable David Hurley, Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, and Her Excellency Mrs Linda Hurley. And we've got some other special guests with us joining us. The Honourable Peter Dutton MP, Minister for Home Affairs, MHR LMP for Queensland. Senator Andrew Bragg, Senator LP, Liberal Party for New South Wales. The Honourable Philip Ruddock, who is the Mayor of Hornsby, New South Wales and former Member of Parliament. Councillor Michael Regan, Mayor Curl Ward, New South Wales. Dr Will Davis, who is the author of The Forgotten, he'll be speaking with us as well shortly. And Mr Albert Wong, who's also contributed and been a driving force behind the book, The Forgotten. And I know that one of Australia's greatest Olympians is with us today, Ian Thorpe. So, hi Thorpe, hope you're well. It's going to be a bit of fun. We've got a big day today, so we've got the National Anthem, where you'll all have to stand up. I know you're sitting there having your Billy Tea and Anzac biscuits at the moment, but at home, all over Australia and all over the world, I believe. So we've got Kamahl will be performing the National Anthem, both verses. You've got to stand for that. Then the Governor-General. After the Governor-General, we're lucky to have the author of the book, Dr Will Davis. He'll be talking with us. And then Albert Wong. And after Albert, we're going to have the last post, which will be played. The last post will be coming us from a houseboat off Newport. 15-year-old Davidson High School girl Sarah Morrison will be playing the last post. And then you'll be upstanding for that. And then you have to wait for a minute. After the last post, we then have reveille. And then it will be the end of the function. But let's get underway straight away with a friend of mine. He's 85. I've only known him for 38 years. Kamahl is one of our greatest entertainers. I remember having lunch with him and a few people after a function in the 80s. And Des Renford was there. And Des Renford, I don't know if you remember, Des swam the English Channel 19 times before he found out there was a ferry. But and the restaurant bought a guest book, and Des signed his name, Des Renford, and he had some letters OBE. And then Kamahl signed his name and put OBE. I said, Kamahl, you haven't got an OBE? He said, oh, yes, I have. Outstanding Brown Entertainer. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend Kamahl, please stand up. Kamahl, are you with us? Are you there? Hopefully we can log into Kamahl and find him. We're Skyping to Warrawee, where he is. Kamahl, come in.
I'm here.
Hi. Okay, please. We're all standing up. You can you can perform the National Anthem, both verses. I'm ready for you.
Okay, you're ready for me, are you?
Absolutely.
Okay, here we go. Australians, all let us rejoice, for we are young and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil. Our home is good by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty rich and rare. In history's page let every state advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair. Beneath our radiant southern star, we'll toil with hearts and hands to make this Commonwealth of ours renowned of all the lands. For those who come across the seas, with boundless plains to share, with courage let us all combine to advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Magnificent. Round of applause. Thank you so much, Kamahl. Thank you very, very much. You held that last note tremendously. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, now I'd like to welcome live from Government House in Canberra to officially launch The Forgotten, which is the untold story of the Chinese Labour Corps and the Chinese Anzacs in the Great War. Please would you welcome His Excellency General the Honourable David Hurley, Governor-General of Australia.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. Linda and I are delighted to be part of this launch today and to see this book come to fruition. I'd also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which you all stand and pay respects to elders past and present, and particularly as we approach Anzac Day, to acknowledge, as we have most appropriately more recently, Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders who served in uniform, and today, in regard to this book, those Chinese Australian Anzacs, who I'll mention in a moment. So, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be able to share the occasion, as I said. I recall very vividly my first meeting with Will and Albert when they came into my office when I was Governor of New South Wales to explore the idea, to explain the idea. And when you've been around as long as I have, you know that you can see in people's eyes when these things will come to fruition. This was not going to be stopped, and this was going to come. And so this day has arrived. One of the very positive outcomes of the centenary of service, the commemoration of the centenary of service that we held here in Australia from 2014 to 2018-19 period, was that we recognised the service and the sacrifice of many individuals and groups that we probably hadn't, or definitely in some, hadn't properly recognised before. Of course, our Indigenous men and women were one of those big groups. And so services at Redfern, like the Black Digger Anzac Day service, the unveiling of a memorial right next to the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park in Sydney. These were all very significant occasions where we remembered those that we hadn't paid due respect to. And The Forgotten, the book we're launching today, introduces us to another group of Australians who served, yet we don't remember as we should. And they are Chinese Australian Anzacs. The Forgotten tells us the background to these Anzacs and importantly gives us the story of several of them who served, and quite a number of them were recognised for their valour during their service. Of course, in a way similar to our Indigenous men and women, many Chinese Australians who served faced racism, segregation, and indeed contempt in what was then a very white Australia. Yet they presented themselves to the recruiting office. They stepped forward because they saw a responsibility, a duty to serve their country. Approximately 250 Chinese Anzacs served, Chinese Australian Anzacs, of whom we believe about 46 were killed. But as important as the story of the Chinese Australian Anzac is in The Forgotten, the book is much more than just their story. It's a book that can be read on many levels. The book positions the story of the Chinese Australian Anzacs on a broader canvas of the Chinese experience in Australia. It follows the arrival of the Chinese in Australia in the early 1800s and explores from then till now the contribution they've made to Australia's development. But again, the book Forgotten delivers more because it introduces us to another forgotten group in World War I, and that's the Chinese Labour Corps that supported the massive logistic exercise and effort that sustained the Allies in the field. And indeed, not mentioned in this book, but on the Russian front, a similar effort by Chinese labourers. Although estimates vary, it can be assumed that approximately 150,000 to 200,000 Chinese labourers assisted the French and the British forces on the Western Front. Their presence freed up valuable manpower from the Allied forces, manpower that could be put into uniform. Chinese labourers were employed by the Allies to man their ordnance depots and to conduct maintenance in rail, road, power and telegraph systems, and importantly, vehicle maintenance. In many areas, they were also used to dig the trench systems that supported the front line and those resting behind. The work was conducted behind the front line, but was not necessarily out of danger. Many Chinese were lost to artillery attacks, and the Chinese also shared the deprivations of life in the field, and again suffered casualties alongside the troops they were supporting. They served for a long period. Those serving for the British ceased their service in Europe in 1920, while those serving for the French in 1922. So from those dates you can see they were largely used after the war for the clean-up of the battlefields in the Western Front. The story of their achievements, their treatment and their contribution deserves to be told, and this is why this book, The Forgotten, is such an important book. The stories on a grand scale like this is World War I, a massive contribution by Chinese labour forces, is strengthened though when it gets to the stories of individuals. So back to the Chinese Anzacs in World War I. The Forgotten introduces us to 18-year-old Royden Tong, who was a postal worker from Ballarat. And in the book you'll find a very concise letter from his father, which gives Royden permission to go and enlist. And it's very formally written as of the period. There's Billy Singh, very famous at Gallipoli as a sniper, who upon return to Australia though, lived a very lonely itinerant life of hard work and low pay and died virtually as a pauper later in life. Of Caleb Shang, who was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal and Bar and the Military Medal. An extraordinary range of service feats that he performed for which he was recognised. And Leslie Longtip, who served with the Light Horse at Bathsheba. And there's a very amusing story. I'll leave you to read the book. Well, we need the sales, so I'll leave you to read the book about his amusing encounter with T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, which brought a chuckle to me. Very Australian. This book informs us of the contribution of Chinese Australian Anzacs in two battles in particular, Fromelles and Pozieres, and these are battles which are just written into our DNA in Australia and which have shaped our understanding of Anzac service on the Western Front. Chinese Anzacs fought in both battles, gave blood and died in both battles. All up, The Forgotten tells a very proud story. We are indebted to Dr. Will Davies and Albert Wong for their persistence in pursuing the research, the writing and the publication of this book. Will in particular, as always, writes with such clarity and such accuracy about the content of any history book he's working on, and is always based on very sound and detailed research. So Will, thank you again for that. Albert, thank you for your drive and dedication. As you state in the preface, you went from ignorance about the Chinese Labour Corps to being quite possessed about that information and wanting it to become known to a broader public. So Will and Albert have produced an important addition to Australia's military history collection, and perhaps as a first, a history book of the First World War printed in two languages in the same book. The Forgotten informs us about our past, but there are aspects of that past that are very relevant today. Read the book to discover that world events and issues can be quite circular in nature. I thank Wilkinson Publishing for producing such a fine book, and particularly for ensuring that today's launch, which we thought would be postponed or cancelled, can occur today, even if by virtual means. I congratulate everybody involved with this book, and on that note, I'm very extremely proud to launch The Forgotten, and just thank you again for illuminating us of part of a very important part of our history and what went on in the Western Front that sustained our soldiers in the field. Thank you.
Thank you very much to His Excellency General the Honourable David Hurley, Governor General of Australia. Wonderful remarks there. And since the book's officially launched, The Forgotten, you can get it at booktopia.com.au. The Forgotten by Dr. Will Davis, preface by Albert Yuling Wong AM. And without further ado, let's hear from the author of the book, author, historian and documentary producer. Please would you welcome Dr. Will Davis.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mark. Could I begin by thanking His Excellency for his kind words in launching The Forgotten and for taking the time in his very busy schedule to support this Australia-Chinese Remembrance Initiative. Could I also thank Albert Wong, who upon hearing of my failed attempt to remember the forgotten of the First World War, came in behind me, commissioned the writing of this book and got it to the point it is today. Thank you for your interest, persistence and determination. But for you, we wouldn't be here today. While this awful virus ravishes the world and seriously disrupts our lives and important events like Anzac Day, let us quickly reflect on the situation just 100 years ago as the world, like now, hopefully looked to recovery. The Great War took an estimated 19 million lives. The influenza pandemic from 1918 to 1920 took some 30 to 50 million lives, some say more. Today, in multicultural Australia, probably half our population have little or no connection to Anzac Day, its importance or relevance, and naturally so. However, not only have millions of immigrant people arrived in Australia, taken up citizenship and contributed to the nation, they've also enlisted in the Defence Forces, have travelled to combat zones and given their lives. We must not forget these Australian service personnel, nor the families and the nations from which they came, and in turn wind them in, include them and welcome them into the broad Anzac family. While I write about Chinese Labour Corps and the virtually unknown part China played in the First World War, what was most interesting for me to discover and research was an unknown chapter of our history and the contribution and sacrifice of men of Chinese heritage in the AIF. These men and their forebears had faced discrimination and torment, racism, even violence, stretching back to the gold rushes of the 1850s. Yet when the time came, they stepped forward to enlist, or, as was often the case, they tried to enlist. Apart from not meeting the physical requirements at the time laid down, they also came up against a clause on the enlistment form which required that they were, quote, of substantially European origin or descent, unquote. While many were residents in Australia going back generations, if they showed Chinese racial characteristics, this could prove a reason for their rejection. Yet these men persisted. They tried and retried, travelled the country, attempting to enlist to towns and cities where they were not known or recognised as Chinese. And when they finally succeeded in enlisting, they joined the ranks of the thousands of young Australians to be sent to the butcher's picnic of the First World War, first to Gallipoli and then the Western Front. Perhaps the most famous Chinese Anzac, as His Excellency mentioned, was Billy Singh, a horse driver who enlisted in Bowen in October 1914. Billy had been born to a Chinese father and an English mother and had grown up in the bush, leaving school at 12. He was tough, resourceful, could handle horses and was a great shot, attributes that would soon find a place in his dangerous and deadly life as a sniper. Accepted into the 5th Light Horse Regiment, he found himself on the second convoy of troops destined for Egypt. He landed on Gallipoli on the 20th of May 1915, the day after the massive attack of an estimated 40,000 Turks on the Australian line, which claimed over 10,000 Turkish casualties. Billy soon got to work taking up a sniping position at Chatham's Post, moving around the front line, often with his observer Ian Idrius, later a noted author. Billy's daily routine was simple and deadly. Having cleaned and oiled his rifle during the night, he and his observer would carefully make their way to his sniping position. Waiting and watching, the observer would carefully scan the Turkish trenches less than 200 metres away, looking for any movement, particularly around the small brick-lined peepholes that dotted the Turkish parapet. Once movement was detected, Billy would be guided to the spot and wait, his eye and rifle carefully sighted on the enemy trench. Then a barely detectable movement and bang, Billy had fired and another Turkish soldier lay dead in the bottom of the trench. By the time Billy Singh was evacuated from Gallipoli in November 1915, his tally was as many as 300. He was recommended for a Distinguished Conduct Medal, and this was officially gazetted on the 11th of January 1916. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry from May to September 1915 at Anzacs as a sniper, his courage and skill were most marked, and he was responsible for a very large number of casualties among the enemy, no risk being too great for him to take." After Gallipoli, Billy served in France, where he was wounded and suffered the effects of gas. He returned to Australia in July 1918 and was as a result, discharged medically unfit. Other Chinese Anzacs were not so lucky. In all, there were 46 Chinese Anzacs killed, including Charles Yu, a 24-year-old married carter, killed along with 7 officers and 153 men in just 3 days in the line at Pozieres. Or George Schreck, a jockey born in Echuca who enlisted in Bendigo. He was just 5 foot 4.5 tall, but at 37 years of age was old by the standards of the time. He, along with another Chinese Anzac, Edward James King, was to be killed in the attack on the windmill above Pozieres, along with 651 casualties from 900 men who went into the attack. And there they died, along with their digger mates, lost forever in the Somme mud. Others also showed great bravery and returned to Australia. Men like Caleb Shang and his younger brother Sydney, both of whom had issues enlisting but also served with distinction. Caleb Shang became the most decorated Chinese Anzac with a Distinguished Conduct Medal and bar and a military medal, his recommendation stating his, quote, contempt for danger and conspicuous gallantry, and adding that his conduct showed a never-failing example of fearlessness, resource and initiative. From what I have read, the Chinese Anzacs were not discriminated against within their fighting battalions, and their deaths in battle and their wounds and the trauma of war affected all men alike. And like all returning diggers, they faced a lack of work prospects, educational opportunities and indifference to their service and sacrifice. To be Chinese would not have helped, and we can be sure that both opportunities and future work prospects would have been grim. Yet again, in the Second World War, members of the Chinese community, both men and women, again enlisted in the services. But back to the forgotten. My hope is that all Australians can read the book, in particular young Chinese Australians along with their parents, to understand the place Chinese immigrants have played in this country since 1818. And in doing so, understand that they, like many immigrant people in Australia, are also part of our proud Anzac tradition. We're part of the dreadful sacrifice and part of our combined remembrance. But what I'm also asking is that the broader Australian community remember this sacrifice, not only of the Chinese people, but of those from many nations, and extend a hand of friendship and inclusion, and in so doing, embrace them and welcome them as part of this proud and enduring tradition, lest we forget.
Thank you, Dr. Will Davis, the author of the forgotten. And so when you get the book, there's obviously the English version, but you also get the Chinese version as well. So you get it in Chinese and in English, and there's plenty of pictures in the middle. The preface for the book, and probably the man who's really been a driving force alongside Will to make this book happen, is Albert Wong. He's a former investment banker, stockbroker, philanthropist and entrepreneur. Please would you welcome him to the lectern. Albert Wong, you're on.
Thank you very much, Max. I also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that we stand on, both past and present. Sir Winston Churchill once said, "A good speech should be like a lady's dress. Short enough or long enough to cover the subject, but short enough to make it or keep it interesting." I wish to pass on my sincere thanks to His Excellency, the Governor-General, and Mrs. Hurley. Most of you wouldn't know, but our Governor-General, who was formerly Governor of New South Wales, had supported Will and I to write this book. And he supported us all the way through, and now as Governor-General. So my heartfelt thanks to him for helping us launch this book today. I also wish to acknowledge and thank PwC, Tom Seymour and Kai Zhang. They were the only corporate entity that supported our vision, and had it not been for the coronavirus, we would have actually physically launched our book last week in Sydney with His Excellency. My thanks to Will Davies for bringing the plight of the Chinese Labour Corps to my attention. And then through our research, we learn of the Chinese Anzacs, thanks to the work done by the Chinese Museum in Melbourne. Not being much of a history buff myself, the story of the Chinese Labour Corps and the Chinese Anzacs really struck a chord with me. I've had the good fortune to have been exposed to many different facets of life and have visited many different places. But I often wondered whether I have done enough, or whether I've done anything really worthwhile, or have I simply wasted the opportunities life has given me. Thanks to the chance encounter with Will through our mutual friend Nick Farr-Jones, it has led to the creation of this book, The Story of the Chinese Labour Corps and the Chinese Anzacs from an Australian Perspective. I hope I can look back and feel that this is a good thing to have done, and that it would make a positive difference to our society. I also wish to thank Dr. Brendan Nelson, who kindly agreed to write the foreword for our book in his capacity as director of the Australian War Memorial at the time. Will and I have previously said of our intention to direct our share of proceeds, if this book sells, to be directed to the Australian War Memorial and the War Widows Guild. So I hope you all go out and buy a copy of this book. I'd just like to talk briefly about preserving all that is good in our country, protecting and embracing our values to pass on to future generations. Never forget the sacrifice of those who came before us, not to take for granted what we have. The current coronavirus pandemic should not divide us, but bring us closer together. These are times of adversity, but compared to the suffering in the previous 2 world wars, we should be grateful for what we have been asked to endure for the greater good. As human beings, none of us are perfect. We are all flawed. My wife keeps reminding me. This makes us human, though. But like human beings, countries are also flawed. No country is perfect. But if there was any country which is close to perfection, as one can imagine, well, in my opinion, it's Australia. Australia is my adopted home. This is where I have spent the past 45 years of my 61 years. I planted my roots here. I finished my education here. I got married here, and both our children are born here. We must protect what is precious and valuable to us. The story of the Chinese Labour Corps and the Chinese Anzacs is one which is not commonly known and needs to be shared, especially amongst the younger generation and those new migrants, particularly those of Chinese ethnicity, so that they can better integrate and assimilate into our Australian way of life. We are blessed to live in a multicultural society made up of so many diverse cultures, but we must also preserve, protect, and embrace the culture of Australia. We live in difficult and sensitive times. The story of the forgotten will remind us of the historical bonds between Australia and China. We must value what we have in common. No doubt we have our differences, but our strong bonds, like any good friendship, should allow us to work through our differences for the better good of all. Now, I must confess that in the course of our research for this book, we realized that the Chinese Labour Corps were not the only groups which assisted and sacrificed for the Allied forces. There were the Indian Labour Corps, the Fijian Labour Corps, and the Egyptian Labour Corps, and many others. Britannia called upon support from the far reaches of her empire, and all these other stories of courage and sacrifice must also be told. But perhaps I'll leave that to others. Finally, tomorrow is Anzac Day. Even though the COVID-19 pandemic forbids us to gather in crowds, I hope that each and every one of us will spend some time to reflect and remember the courage and sacrifice, especially those who made the ultimate sacrifice to protect our country and our way of life, lest we forget. Again, my sincere thanks to His Excellency and everyone for joining us for the virtual book launch of The Forgotten today. Please stay for the last post, performed by Sarah Morrison. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. And now I've to have direct from the Pittwater near Newport. I'd like you all to be upstanding for the Sarah Morrison is going to play the last post. Then there'll be a 1 minute of silence and reflection, and then she'll play Reveille. Please, would you welcome 15 years old from Davidson High School, Sarah Morrison, to play the last post, 1 minute silence, and then Reveille. Please be upstanding. from Pittwater near Newport on the houseboat there where they're staying. And thank you all for being with us today. Again, if you wish to purchase the book, it's available, The Forgotten by Will Davis. You can get it at booktopia.com.au. Thank you to Wilkinson Publishing. Thank you to Kamahl. Thank you to Sarah. And of course, thank you to Will and Albert. And most importantly, really appreciate the time given by His Excellency General, the Governor-General of Australia, the Honourable David Hurley. We thank him as well. And thank you. And the link that you've been watching on, you can share with your friends and family and colleagues. That'll be up for at least 7 days until the 1st of May, if not longer. So feel free to share that. And thank you again for all being with us today. Have a great rest of your Friday, and we'll see you again soon, hopefully. Cheers.